Students, here we are. I want to go through the next chapter with you. If you notice that this is chapter 5, States of Consciousness, we are skipping chapter 4 right now, but we're definitely coming back to it. It's a really important chapter on sensation and perception. It's a long chapter, but states of consciousness is important, but we can get through it quickly. So my hope is by next Thursday, we only have 4 days of school next week, we'll be done with the states of consciousness, which means we actually won't take a test on the states of consciousness chapter. So what is consciousness? Let's get into this a little bit. Consciousness is our level of awareness about ourselves and our environment. But I don't want you to think of consciousness as like an on-off switch. Like we're not conscious or unconscious. Now, obviously, if we're knocked unconscious, that's a different thing. But we're talking about our level of awareness. And so there's some states of consciousness, and we'll talk about these. They can range from being like asleep to awake, and even in an altered state. So some states of consciousness that can happen in a few different ways, and maybe you're familiar with really all of them generally as simultaneously, physiologically induced or psychologically induced. So daydreaming, if you're anything like me, you look out the window and then somebody's talking and like you can hear them talking, but you don't really think, you're kind of in this other state. Dreaming, we'll talk a lot about dreams. This is a fun chapter that we get to talk about dreams and what they mean and our interpretation of it. Physiologically induced hallucinations, orgasm, food or oxygen starvation, and psychologically induced like sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and meditation. Let's talk about meditation. If you know any yogis, if you practice yoga yourself, there are people who are really good at getting themselves into a meditative state. And this takes some practice, and because think of it in the last chapter, remember when our parasympathetic system had to kind of bring us down? Sometimes our bodies don't do that as efficiently or as well as we can, and we're just constantly like uptight and like anxious. And so if you can work on making yourself more calm and kind of, there's this idea of, it's called headspace, kind of giving yourself this ability to center your focus. And so this is meditation. Hypnosis, we will talk a little bit about. If you know like sensory deprivation, if you've ever heard of mystics, one of the more famous American mystic is Thomas Merton. He was a Trappist monk, where we can understand this. Obstetricians, OB doctors who deliver babies, they might be able to help their patients and women through childbirth with some of these kind of states of consciousness through different techniques of like managing pain. So let's go in and start talking about hypnosis. Now, a lot of people like to talk about hypnosis, and it's like really cool and really intriguing. And the only thing I'm going to really say, at least from the Catholic standpoint, is that essentially hypnosis is you are giving your free will over to somebody else to control and manipulate. Now, I'm not going to bash on hypnotics or hypnotists, but I am saying that you're kind of giving up what God has given you for somebody else to control and manipulate. And so it's this altered state of consciousness. Now, I gotta say that some people are more hypnotizable than others. If you are kind of open and suggestible to it, some people might call like those people like naive or whatever it might be, you might be able to be hypnotized. But if absolutely in your mind you think there's no way somebody's going to hypnotize me, you're probably not going to be hypnotized, right? Like it's not some magic trick it's kind of like a magic trick, but it's not like they can do it without your kind of consent to it. So you have to be open to being hypnotized and suggestible. And the one guy that you need to talk about is Ernest Hilgard. And Ernest Hilgard, he's an older psychologist who started looking into the field of hypnosis as a social influence. And what I mean by that is there's this kind of like state of dissociation where you might think and feel one way, but you say and do another thing. And so you're able to kind of split your consciousness. And somebody probably does that for you. And so it's called a state of dissociation. So let me explain what's going on. So this is Ernest Hilgard here. By the way, Ernest Hilgard was born and raised in a town that I used to live in, Belleville, Illinois, although he died probably about the time I lived there, but he was a very old man, never obviously knew the man. But he did this famous study. Now we're talking like the late 40s, early 50s, and this was the first of its kind, where he wanted to demonstrate this divided consciousness. So here's what he did. You see this woman here, and he took a patient and he said, okay, you're not going to feel any pain when I put your arm into this freezing cold ice water bath. So he does, he puts her in a hypnotic state, he puts her arm into this water, and she doesn't feel any pain. Like he says, you're not going to feel any pain, and all the sensation that she has, all of those neurons that are firing, she doesn't feel any pain. And then he says, I'm going to ring this bell, and when I ring the bell, you're going to feel the pain of this ice bath. And then she felt the pain. Like he could dictate. So she might have been experiencing the pain physiologically, but she didn't feel the pain psychologically. And that's kind of what this dissociation means. And so that's really kind of his landmark contribution to psychology. So let's talk about this. I wanted to put this part in the last chapter, but I knew we wouldn't get to it. We were going to run out of time, and it's easy to put in this chapter. So if we're going to look at consciousness and how we measure the brain or examine the brain, we need to talk about the ways to do that. And kind of the first idea is this idea of a lesion. Now keep in mind, lesions are like when there's damage or destruction to the brain, to the tissue. Now it can be done experimentally, like you can like shave off or take off a piece. That would maybe like for a tumor or something, to examine it and run some data to see if it's cancerous or whatever it might be. But it also can happen naturally in brain tissue. And some of the ways that we then kind of test and look at this might be with these different types of brain tests. One is an EEG, or electroencephalogram. You can see this little girl there. She's got an EEG machine on. It records our brain activity with these kind of like probes, these little electrodes on our scalp. Now, you see from that screen that it's kind of recording her brain waves. That will be really important when we get into the part about sleep. That's what an EEG machine primarily would do. A CT machine. A computed tomography, you might have heard it as a CAT scan. Now, if you've ever had a sports injury or anything like that, you probably have had a CAT scan. They are an X-ray, so it's not really harmful, but it is radioactive, material. In this case of the brain, but you can have a CT scan of like pretty much any part of the body to reveal damage. There's some good things for a CT scan, and then there's some not so good things of a CT scan. One of the best things is that it's really fast. And for our case, if we're talking about like stroke victims, if time is of the essence and you need to see if there was in fact a stroke on the brain, a CT scan is absolutely the best way to go because it's fast. You get the results back pretty quickly, and they're widely available and like pretty cheap. I'm not going to say cheap, but much less expensive than other brain tests might be. For instance, like an MRI. Magnetic resonance imaging. Now this shows brain anatomy, and even if you look at this one, like we can really see really good brain anatomy. You can tell the brainstem, you can see the hypothalamus, you can see like the cerebellum. There's really good, strong anatomy that we can pick out from this MRI. It's really great to see like more damaged areas. You can really pinpoint and understand the anatomy with an MRI. But there are some downfalls. One, you don't get the results back nearly as fast. Now, having said that, 20 years ago, an MRI result might have taken a few days to get back, several days maybe to get back. Today, we can probably get an MRI back in a day. Like, they're a lot faster. Not as fast as a CT scan, but definitely faster. They're much better to really investigate and see what has happened, but they're still not that fast. But if time is not of the essence, then an MRI might be the way to go. They're a lot more expensive though. Let me give you a little scenario. Let's say that you are in small town North Dakota, Cooperstown, North Dakota, and you're worried that, I don't know, something's going on. Chances of Cooperstown, North Dakota at the local clinic of having an MRI machine is not, they're not going to have one. They'll probably have a CT scanner, but they're probably not going to have an MRI machine. You're going to have to go to Fargo or Grand Forks or whatever for that. But the CT scan is not going to tell you as much. It also doesn't use, an MRI doesn't use x-rays. So people who can't have an x-ray, so say if you're pregnant, or maybe you have like a pacemaker, something that doesn't allow you to take in any extra radiation, maybe an MRI is really your only option. What I would say is if you're going to have an MRI done, your doctor recommends it, make sure your insurance company is okay with it, because they don't like to pay for MRIs if they don't have to. They think they can get away with a CT scan. So just make sure your insurance company is going to approve it. Otherwise you might get a bill that you were hoping not to pay for like thousands of dollars. And so finally, a PET scan, positron emission tomography scan. And this is a visual display of the brain activity when it's given radioactive glucose. And what I mean by that is, like, glucose is the primary fuel for our brain. It's what kind of feeds, if you know why I call it brain food, right? Because it feeds off glucose, that hit of sugar. Now you're gonna light up, your brain's gonna light up because it's feeding off of this glucose. It's not gonna last for very long, but it's really good to kind of, what's the word, detect or predict diseases. Whereas an MRI is really good at seeing anatomy, and a CT scan is good at looking at damage, or something that's maybe wrong. The PET scan is really good at seeing other types of diseases that neither of those tests would really show. So PET scans are oftentimes, we see in this chart here, for people who have Alzheimer's. Now, I am not a radiologist, nor do I play one on TV, but I can tell there's a big difference between that normal brain and that Alzheimer's diseased brain. I don't exactly know what I'm looking for, but I do see there are parts of that brain that are not lighting up, which tells me that there's part of the there's like dead tissue or something is going on, that connection, that neural connection is not being made when it's being fed with this glucose to make an action potential, to make that neural transmission. So depending on what's going on is going to depend on the type of test that we need to take. All right, that's it. So some of you are going to be talking about the notes in class on sleep. Some of you are going to be doing these notes and then talking about sleep, or vice versa. But either way, we're going to come back together and talk about sleep stages, which are really hugely important. All right, talk to you next time. Bye.